Good morning, everyone, and welcome to University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Architecture and Urban Planning. I'm your host today, Professor Mark Keene, with a couple of draw-along lectures on key pieces of architecture within the city. So we're going to start with a little bit of contextualism of what we're going to draw and how the three relate to each other. And then we're going to get into a little bit of a sort of a practice course in about 3 minutes on perspective, the basics, just in case you need some sort of reconstruction of some of the principles you've heard over the years. Then we're going to jump right into one of our sacred old buildings in town, St. Josaphat, which we see here on the left in the small RP model. And we'll talk about contemporary work and the work of Calatrava. And in the middle, we'll talk about Frank Lloyd Wright, since this map indicates we're kind of in the center of what we refer to as the design arc in Wisconsin and Illinois. So the state line between the two states is roughly here, this dotted line, just south, splitting Beloit. And if you look at Chicago down here in the lower right, and then Spring Green up here, you sort of see the arc of Frank Lloyd Wright's career and the core of it, certainly in the early half, where he worked and practiced in Chicago. And then 1911, he builds his home and studio from Oak Park to Spring Green, Wisconsin. And all the modern masterworks that he created came out of these two sites, Oak Park, Illinois, Spring Green, Wisconsin, as well as his winter camp in Scottsdale, Arizona. So if you consider this sort of a boomerang shape, moving along the highway system between Taliesin, Madison, University of Wisconsin, us in Milwaukee, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Syrup, and then down the lake, what we're seeing here now with the black dots, this is the Roby House, Unity Temple, Jacobs One House, and Taliesin proper. Those are 4 of the 8 World Heritage Sites as of 2019 that Wright's been accommodated with to show the massive institution towards design that Wright was as a practitioner. He was born just west of Madison, about 20 minutes in Richland Center, attended Madison University for engineering and stepped out in his second semester. And after that, simply went to Chicago and started working for master architect Louis Sullivan. From there, he goes on to create a series of 1,000+ projects. Many got built. There's about 450 that still stand, and they're all remarkable. But then again, in 2019, they honored the 4 here in this arc with 4 others, such as Falling Water, Hollyhock, Taliesin West, and the Guggenheim in New York. Those 8 now are World Heritage Sites. So that impact of Wright is going to talk about the language of the 3 we selected, or the many buildings to choose from in Milwaukee, that you'll draw along with me. So hopefully by now you've printed out the assigned PDF that comes with each of the sketches. And with that PDF, we'll be able to construct some of the principles of perspective and then talk about the 3 principal buildings that hopefully you'll visit while you're here as well. So before we begin with St. Josaphat proper, I'd like you to take a piece of just blank paper, 8.5 by 11, just to review some of the key principles of perspective. So I think I can boil this down into 3 points that you're probably all aware of, that you have to have the horizon line drawn in to locate human relationship to your content, to your architecture. And then 2, on that horizon line are the vanishing points, right and left. And certainly for the 3rd, then, in order to actually see this as a 3-dimensional object in space, we have to add value. And that value is already given to you in its ultimate brightness, the sun's light itself, with 0%, and that's page white. I choose to use black Prismacolor on these types of draw-along lectures because it allows you to move that value from 0% to 100%. So if you're using a black Prismacolor now, which I hope you are, you'll find that in sort of our bar graph of value, 0 to 100, we're given 0, but just with very light pressure, we can get to 20% and 30% and finally 50 or 60, which is really how to see the world in grays. But the highlights to it in the shade and shadow areas makes it go darker and darker and darker. So when you come to the end of the bar, you're actually at as deep as the media can take you. And that's the black of the black Prismacolor. So that's what's nice about this media. It's stronger than straight pencil stocks like a 2B or 4B and doesn't smear as much once you're done with the information. So now if we can kind of move to the idea of our key principles, let's back up and draw that horizon line just to the middle of the paper. And our subject is going to be something very simplistic, a cubic volume. Since a lot of architecture is orthogonal and cubic in nature, there's probably only 12 ways to actually draw architecture. They're all kind of predicated coming off of orthogonal forms. So when we look at this, it has one concept which is defies logic, defies science, in the sense that we're all trained from a very young age that parallel lines in our science and math classes never converge. So there's a whole series of parallel lines in a cube that never converge in space. And that's their definition. And yet the eye sees them as converging. So even holding this up to you now, it almost seems as if this top line, this one, are going to come down to a point someplace in the distance, far away, but yet they do meet in space. Same with the two on this side are going to vanish to a point in space too. And that's because our eye is a volume such that it takes the flat plane and converts it over the actual movement of the volume of our eye. And so we have to see in the same way when we put that on a two-dimensional plane on a piece of paper. So what we're going to do is draw this cube really quickly just to kind of announce those ideas of the horizon line and the vanishing point. And we're kind of think of this as maybe a relation to a human being. So first what we'll do is we'll put somebody in the space. If this is the horizon, let's say we're looking out towards Lake Michigan on the eastern part of our map I just showed you. And there's a person in the distance standing right by the edge. And the horizon line is right at their eye height. So right in the middle of their head in that little circle. And on top of that, relative to the size of the head you just drew, there's a torso. And the torso stops and it's held up by the legs. So right away, we indicate some type of scale in our sketch here. So the distance from here to the edge is a depth related to the height of the person. If we move that person closer to us, we simply enlarge the scale of the head, enlarge the size of the torso, than the person. So now the person has walked closer to us, and now we know the relative distance because of the heights of the human scale, 5.5 to 6.5 feet tall. So if you put away in the distance over here, it's a very small dot, a little larger dot for the body and the legs. So within a couple seconds here now, I put a pretty large distance of feet on the plane of the Earth here up to the horizon line. So now I want to put in a three-dimensional volume in that space too. Let's take this corner, which is closest to us in the cubic volume, and put about 2/3 of it above the line and 1/3 beneath the line. That way it's got a much taller scale to the people, so it might be a small house when our cube is done here. So now what we have to do is make sure that the tops and bottoms of both of these lines vanish to one point. So let's take the left side of the box first, and we'll put the vanishing point for it closer to us. You'll see in a second why it shows close, and now we're going to take the two right lines and put them further away to a point. Now, what's nice about something we know that's purely cubic is that we can see the squares vanish in perspective appropriately to the proportion of an equal square. So if I said that this was a square, you'd say, no, it's not, it's a flat rectangle. If I said this was a square, you'd say, no, it's a tall rectangle. If I did this, you'd say, I'm pretty close. And since we're sketching, pretty close is just enough. The same is true for this size. It won't be the exact same proportion or reflection of that square because we're seeing more of the front than we are of the left. So it's going to reduce that, and yet it still ends up being a square-like form, even though this distance is shorter than that distance. And that's predicated on where we put those points. If we shift the points and put the right close and left over here, the box then rotates. So in a sense, it's like a slow motion software, and the software changes as you move the points back and forth. So now we're done with the perspective. Step 1 and step 2 are accomplished, and that's basically the principles of what was reintroduced into the Western canon in the Renaissance by people like Da Vinci and Brunelleschi and Renaissance painters, where they tried to be more accurate with perspective and spatial construction in their paintings. The next piece is going to be value, and we're going to make sure that, not unlike the dock camera here that has a very light side on this side now and a darker side over here, and the darker side underneath and a cast shadow, there's changing value, even though it's the same wood on all 6 sides. As light hits it, it changed the relationship of how we see that piece of wood. So we're going to assume the sun's going to hit the front side of our building here, which means the whole left side will receive a value. So that helps pull that out 3-dimensionally right away. Now we're going to say that since it hits here, as it comes down to the ground, it casts a shadow on the ground. So if it's coming from this side, it'll angle out a shadow. Then the top of this, which casts a shadow on the ground, is a parallel line, will come back to the same vanishing point here. So it'll angle back to that. On the back side of the cube, the light hits and projects another angular line that goes back to the right vanishing point. So it moves around the base, and in our ways of indicating value, that's the brightest, the shade side is the second, the middle gray, and finally the shadow is always the darkest. So we can make that closer to black. And now it seems like it sits on the ground, it's got some mass to it, some gravitas. So we can play a little bit with the landscape around here to help pull this volume out by saying, for instance, let's say there's a tree in the backdrop. Now that tree, if it's part of the same planting in an urban area, maybe all the trees are the same scale, the tops of those will vanish back and the bottom will vanish back as well. So we can put another exact same tree, but it's a smaller ball here now, and another one, and then another one. So if we value those, the dark green next to our, let's say, brighter stone or wood painted facade, it holds that corner and actually creates a more sense of space where there's things behind our building. Dropping this down and dropping that down gives us that sense of depth. Now to enhance the base plane, we can come off the left vanishing point, any angle we want, make a turn and goes back to the right vanishing point, and maybe that's the lot line for our building or structure or cubic volume. Maybe on this side, coming off the right corner a little bit, we see the end of the lot line over there, and perhaps it's a gradation of a tone for grass or some base material that's different than the rest. So now we have a propriety to this space that we're working with in terms of a design project. And that's basically the heart of all perspective. And you can manipulate that left and right. One of the things you want to do towards the end now, since we've gone through 0 all the way to about this darkness, is get to jet black at certain points. And the key aspect there then is to realize that it's a visual illusion of how all these planes play in space. And so we want to pull out the edges where there's a shift change in color or depth of value. So those edges then want to become darker with our gray right where it meets the next plane. Have that base, now this, and now the front edge of this plane comes to the white, and actually that gray reads darker right adjacent to the white, so that even it's the same tone on that shade side, that part of the gray looks darker because of the brightness of this white. So now what happens now with the value treatment, I think you can see a little bit of an illusion that this white on the front of this box is actually brighter than the white over here. And it's the same white on the same piece of paper, but we've created the illusion of being more dominant now in terms of the subject because of the way we played with value. So check marks for all 3 of those, and you accomplish the fundamentals of perspective. So now we'll start with our first piece in Milwaukee. And this is not unlike most other cities that at this time in the late 19th century, moving into the 20th century, we're still really working with a lot of the Western canon that's brought over from Europe. Indeed, in this case, it's a very rigorous type of neoclassical language because the faithful on this side of the Basilica of St. Josaphat was a Polish group of Catholics in Milwaukee, and their seat of their religion was really predicated on trying to modeling their architecture after St. Peter's in Rome. So we're going to have a very sort of Roman neoclassical building here built in Milwaukee in the latter part of the 1900s and then finished by 1901. And it's called St. Josaphat. And we're going to look at it from a typical viewpoint at the base on the street that it's located, as most people would see it as they would walk up to it. So our view shed is right about here. So at our horizon line for 6 feet, we're right at the base of the building across. And so most of the architecture will be above the horizon line. So on your piece of paper, it's dropped really low so that we can fit the actual dome on top of the actual size of the paper we're working with. But as you can see, it really is a whole series of cubic volumes. And every one of these cubic volumes that is parallel to each other in consequence with the exact same orientation of their cubes uses only the 2 points. So what we're simply going to do is draw a box and stack it until we create the massing of Josaphat, and then we'll start to detail into kind of that Roman classicism. So I'll kind of hold this over here as reference, but I'll begin with one of the principal boxes. It's the one which holds the actual dome itself. So think of this as the base cube area, and then sort of the plinth, the necking of it, the drum of the dome, and finally the cylindrical ball that sits on top of that. So we're going to come to the edge, which is the key corner right here, and drop this down to grade. On the other side, it just eclipses the little projection of the wing over on this side. And then here's our horizon line. So it's going to come to that horizon line and then kind of be stopped because normally you'd see that hit the grade, but we don't here because it's raised up on a wall. So there's going to be a bit of a change right about here. But this wall is going to start to run back toward the rest of the church at a bit of an angle that's going to run back to the left vanishing point. And the left vanishing point, I've given you some starter lines here. At the top of the 2 bell towers, at the left side of this, all these lines are rushing back to the same point over on this side. So if we take that down, it's almost right at the edge of the piece of paper, our left vanishing point. So all these left sides of these boxes which meet and merge together are going to be coming down to that point. We don't have to too much worry about it right now in terms of these lines there, because we'll eliminate those with value later on. So that's the edge of our turn that comes down for the plinth for the dome up there. Now the right vanishing point, and this is typical for most sketches, is that one of the points will probably be on your page at all time for control, and one will have to be thrown well off the paper. If we had to put both pieces on the paper, you'll find that the drawing then will end up being very small to control both of those on the piece of paper. So one would be on one side of it and one would be thrown off to the right. So now you just have to use projection to understand that the top of this cube from this corner to that is going to eventually come down the horizon line, but probably scale-wise about 12 inches off the paper. But knowingly, we know the rest of the sketch that any horizontal line has to vanish. They're going to appear parallel to our eye, but on the piece of paper, they're not parallel lines. Okay, here's a little bit of a tricky part about the dome itself. It's got chamfered corners, so it actually is an octagon up top. So this side is part of the cube that comes out in space, then returns back that way. So if we finish that, that vanishes to the left, this vanishes to the right, but here where I've drawn the little tick marks is the side of the octagon that faces us. And that'll run behind this little pediment on this side, which then has its own run back to vanishing point. So there's one wing, and there's the second wing. So we have a base to kind of mask this large piece of domical volume on the top. It's going to have a rotunda over the main nave on the inside. So it's going to rise up to a certain point, and the edges here show how wide that circle is. So basically in plan type, at this part of the church, it simply is a pure cubic space. And tangential to that, you can inscribe a circle into it. So we're going to try to do that now in perspective. And so what'll happen up here is that right when we come to the middle of the dome, that in a sense could be inscribed in the square that comes down this way over to its edge. And at this point, that could run back this way. So our arc of our circle is going to be able to be in the middle of here, in the middle of this line. So the arc of it is going to run like this all the way across to the back side over here as it wraps around. Because that circle up here, as you look up underneath it, is inscribed in a circle that's up in that square up atop. So sitting on top of that right now is the hemispherical dome. So we see half of a ball here. But every dome in Christendom or just globally has got its own attributes that sort of vary on just how pure a volume it is. And I think you can see by the elevation here, it's a little bit elongated. It's not a pure flat top to it like it's an actual ball, which would make our job really easy. If you come across a dome which is absolutely a perfect spherical shape, then a circle in perspective looks the same no matter it's an elevation or from any view, it simply is a ball. We can start with that and say, here's where we're going to have half the ball come down and touch. So the ball is going to rotate it around, but in this case, it's a little bit elongated on top of that. And that's how that's going to sit on top of that point and down to the different zones of the necking. So there's the next one that comes around the little top cornice line, and then finally to the fenestrated openings that wrap around the rotunda. So on top of that rests the cupola, and for now we'll simply just put the cylinder up there and yet a secondary dome. So that's another circle in space. You could draw the whole circle in, then to get underside that, we're also going to wrap around that half we'll see, which truncates that part of the cupola. So now we have the base of the floor plan, and from there, this is the crossing of the Christ that Jesus was crucified on. And so now the body of the church comes out more toward the nave until the frontispiece of the twin towers, and the clergy then have their part of the cross that goes towards, in this case, the south part of the site. Most Christian churches, for the longest time from the dawn of Christian architecture on, were laid along an east-west axis so that you'd have the rising sun representing Christ coming at the clerical part of the church and lighting up the altar. And then the city side, the urban place, the relationship to the town would face west where the people are, and that's where the sun sets then for them. Okay, so if we come out to the front now, we're going to address the two twin towers over here. And so what happens is right about this point, at the height of this, we have one tower coming over and back down. We're into the ground. That comes to a certain point, continues, and we have the other twin tower right about there. So they're the same size because we're seeing them in a forced perspective here. The distance between those two lines obviously is smaller for the further that runs away from us. Out in front of the two twin towers is the very classical sort of temple front to it. And this is predicated again on that Roman classicism from the architects of St. Peter's in the 1660s and how they developed that architecture based on the code of the classical language all the way back to Greek architecture. So that temple front is going to have its series of 6 columns here. So if we draw simply a box, that at this point it's going to be rising up, so it's a bit above the horizon line where it sits down, and there'll be 6 lines drawn through it because the columns themselves, which are actually going to have spaces for people to access the building, are going to collapse into not showing the spaces much at all. It's just a line that separates those columns. And then the entablature, and then finally coming up to the promise of the pediment up above. There's room for the capitals there too. So that's the frontispiece that faces to the north off of Lincoln Avenue in Milwaukee, up to these towers. It's got a little bit of a blend of architecture. This is a little bit more Romanesque up here with the 2 bell towers up here. I've got 3 stages to them, so they're rising up. And so once you come to the corner against box-like, return to the left vanishing point, return to the left vanishing point. Here and here. And down in the foreground here, there's some administrative building for the clerical staff. So they have a little bit of a presence on the campus too. This joins over here. There's another small piece of architecture at this point. And then the wings. Rise up. So it's box after box. We're drawing from the bell tower to the neck that'll link the nave from the twin towers into the nave proper into the crossing. Then the series of stacked volumes which rise up and support the dome. So we're going around the corner to a point. And as these rotate around here, we see less and less of the arch proper. It's probably brought us right in the center here. Let's support that. And then through to the far southern end. And this little building ends right about here. So now all of our key principal aspects of the massing of this are sort of set up and shows kind of the collaboration of the pieces coming to effect to imitate or mimic the language of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The real fascinating thing about this church, and why it became a basilica, the third basilica honored by the Pope back in 1901, is that it was designed by an architect to be done from scratch out of brick. Local material, cheaper. And then all of a sudden, the head priest found out that there was a building in Chicago was about to be razed because it was a young building, a massive building, a U.S. Customs building, but it was being razed because it had problems with its foundations. So the building was going to fail one way or another because the building was too large or poorly designed. So the fact that all the material there was brand new and ready to be salvaged. So they went down there as a parish, and they got 200,000 tons of salvage material from the U.S. Customs building for about $20,000 at the time. And with that, they delivered it to Milwaukee on 500 railroad flat cars and shipped materials up on boats up the lake, where the parishioners themselves became the actual job crew. And over the course of the next 6 years, built the basilica out of another building. So it's almost like the ultimate Lego set, where you're giving all these component parts that weren't part of your design, and you had to simply take them out and number them all piece by piece on large sheets of drawings, what you could work with, and then try to rebuild your scheme predicated on a much less expensive but higher quality final product because of the money the federal government spent on the building, which are now basically the U.S. Customs in Chicago redefined at St. Josaphat's in Milwaukee. So what we're going to do to kind of make this, we've worked with our vanishing points, we have a horizon line. Now next we're going to use value, because let's say, for instance, if we wanted to stop this sketch earlier without a lot of detail, we'd want some value beyond this perspective to talk more about the building. So we'll wrap this around and show the frontispiece here really quick as it comes up. Now the hat. Now the whole projection now is, this is southern exposure, and we're looking at the western side, which gets all the sunlight in the afternoon. So that's great to light up all of our boxes on this side. So we're going to assume it's probably mid-afternoon in the fall, so it's not going to wrap around to the north and light this up. So it makes the whole north side be in shade. So we can simply work our way from this side of the drawing across on all the planes which face north and simply wash them very quickly with a medium gray. And what we'll do in the case of the ball, we'll start certainly on the left side of it, which doesn't receive the light. But instead of having an edge to it, this acts as if it was an actual spherical ball. And so the highlight will actually be sort of on a round shape of light that will hit this. So our value will come up and meet that, and then it'll kind of roll around to the other side and be dark as well. So it's brightest right where the sun has the closest part to it. So if it's in the afternoon and setting, it's going to heat up this part of the dome, but less as the dome kind of runs away in 3 dimensions on that side. This is a cylinder, so that's more of a straight flow from the left to that hot spot, and then over to the south side to another dark area, and that'll get that place to move. This faces north, this faces north, this faces north. This whole wall does on the street of Lincoln. Or the admin over here. Or the plinth. Comes to the corner here and here. And just instantly now, it's got more of a sense of being maybe a paper or a cutout model that you've kind of made quickly as a schematic design for a project. And now we're saying that these are all the lit spaces, which creates more of the aspect of depth now in the sketch. So now we want to come into it and do some of the fenestration, which shows where some of the stained glass and tells the story of light coming from the source of their religion into the space proper, and it lights up scenes, biblical scenes through the stained glass designs themselves. So up here in this area that runs around the drum of the dome, we're going to make all these areas darker periodically because they are glazed. And then up top, wherever there's glazing, there's a square that's glazed above it. So this is how they can lighten the low by not having it be in the same material of the stone that goes up. By making that glass, it lets the light penetrate the interior volume. Up on the top of the more like Italianate Romanesque bell towers here, we could actually take the rise up and show two other twin arches here. It marches up through a box. And up top then, where the bell tower rings, it's actually more open air. So again, they're trying to lighten the structure. In this case, it's a 3-part. And those arches will rise up. And because it's open air, we'll double these up to show the delicate line of the columns to support that. But now we're going to see the roof line that we see outside here actually come through the interior space. So projecting back to the left vanishing point, it'll come down to this corner and eventually meet that. So if we draw that dark, now it's all of a sudden seems as if this is an open air kind of bird cage up there so that things can fly through it. So we'll do kind of a quick line value of that on this side to anticipate that as well. And now this is fairly far back, so it'll only have a little bit of relief here for us around there. And then this will twin up with line work too. So where we can, when it's the actual primary elevation, we're looking to the west now, we'll detail it more. Around the corner will be more like a sketch to kind of show some of the articulation without having to actually render it out. And I keep switching my array of pencils here. They're all the same black Prismacolor, but I sharpen 5 or 6 in advance to make sure I always have the ability to do a fine line if I need to. So that'll be the same over here. We're going to come and look at the profile that to protect the facade, the pitches and projections are more dynamic than we've sketched so far. Basically, we're working just volume up until then. And so the pediment piece that rises over protects the entablature. And the columns have got their heads on down to the base. And then we'll see that one side column here in its full thickness. And then this gets edge has got that tone all the way coming down to the base there. And now to help the drum have a sense of movement around it, we can look back into the actual ribs of the copper dome up here, which work their way around on the same sequence of spacing, but they have to bow out to show the change in value of how that geometry is moving across that page. So they catch a little bit of the light, show some of that darkness. And at the top here, from our top cupola down, again, there's going to be some fenestration that's open and some that isn't with the arches. And then we can rotate that along too. Up to the top. Okay. Now on the faces over here, there's one major arch that carries down the load of the structure to the ground here. This admin building has a bit of a pyramidal roof to it. And it's a darker tone in the siding. And then each of the side supports, and you can see how a lot of the churches are structured to make it able to lift structure this far off. This is trying to have the whole structure fail by pushing down and having walls come out to the side. So the dead weight of a planned church that comes and supports the dome shows pieces on the side that will support it, and then secondary ones support that. So in fact, the churches of domes of this size are actually triangulated. So in a sense, it's a pyramidal form overall, but it looks like a series of boxes and squares that are simply adjacent to each other, but they're working hard to prevent the failure of the structure. So twin arches on either side here. This receives a little bit less light than the one that's due west. And so it's starting to take shape in terms of where we want our value to go. And we only have like 5-8 minutes left on this. So we're simply going to draw more into it. So when you're in control of the sketch or a drawing, you want to make sure that whenever you stop, you're complete for that amount of time. So you kind of lay it out, it's all drawn. You lay out initial value and it's all drawn. So you can stop, and that's a good 8, 10, 12-minute sketch. If you want to keep learning more information, you can bring it more towards a drawing and detail more and more. We're going to do some of that now to give it its place and give some sense of the scale of the site around it by showing the size of mature tree and landscaping and how the city kind of moves with it. So the largest type of forestry here is left in the south part of the area by the parking garage. So there's a series of trees back here which will come down, not only the grade because we're going to see beneath them, and they're going to be a nice value next to the church as we simply give that kind of icon of something that's happy in the distance. And then on the left side here, it's the street frontage of a commercial street. So rather than seem like it's on the precipice of the end of the earth, we're actually going to take down about a 2-story height here of architecture that simply makes its way down the street, and it's got different sizes and scales. And it's just a graphic for it. It's not literally what happens there, but it shows that it's a very animated street that St. Josaphat's on. And since they're facing north, most of those will be darker. Maybe they catch a little bit of light. Maybe we'll make them really dark right next to the church. But now we kind of have the scale of the street in front of us. And potentially behind them, to illuminate some of our lights, are some of the larger trees in the neighborhood, which might be darker than 2, or some trees in front. So that gives you a scale of kind of setting the building down on the earth there. What we'll do now is really kind of with a finer dark now come back in and articulate some of the details around the more celebrated aspects. So for instance, on the western window that lets in the most light in the nave midday, it's got a hemispherical arch at the top, and that drops down 2.5 stories. And right there is a nice floral pattern of stained glass. And again, that's not the subjects. We're just going to draw it a little bit through here. And then give the pediment up here more dimension and depth. Last, cast a shadow there. Down. And then in the foreground, there's vegetation on this little plinth that faces west. So there's some parking here, a little bit of a respite, little park area. So we're going to put just some sort of foreground aspect, which kind of start the drawing too. And because it's vegetation, it's often much darker than the architecture itself. So those will simply be in the foreground here. And they might be more conifers instead of deciduous, so they're much darker green, and they kind of hit this pattern. And then they're lower scale over here, but it gives kind of a base for the white of the architecture. we're going to do for all the trees, because the trees themselves are three-dimensional volumes. You don't want to do them completely planar because the top of the tree casts a shadow on the lower third of the tree. So wherever you found the vegetation to date, just come back in and make that much darker. And that helps, again, sit down the base of the sketch in its order on the site that you sketched up so far. And our last step is to simply wash over left to right where our ultimate blacks are going to go, because we've made it to that point where all of our value and all of our perspective is fairly complete, and now you want to work on this aspect of the drawing. And that's only a very small percentage, maybe 2, 3, 4%, but it's going to end up helping us kind of project the value of the scheme here. So this edge of this tower is a nice strong line that comes down, and then there's some of the added detail as we finalize the aspect here. But we want that edge nice and strong so that this part of the church behind it is a nice black that meets that. Then it comes over to this edge and it gets darker again next to where the light is striking it. And that helps create that drop in the architecture between the twin towers in the front and the top of the nave there. Let's see, then we'll come down to here. Speaking of the top of the nave, that's the roof that comes down and meets that section. And then what happens, this tower, because it's west, will actually cast a shadow on the further east tower, west tower and east tower, so that it'll be lit by the sun up here from its high sun, but at this point down, it actually gets a cast shadow from that tower. So that helps kind of animate the difference between those, because you want to really catch that white, meaning that's going to be a little bit darker. All the way up to this edge, this will become darker to that edge, and then our returning part of the frontispiece here. So now people walk up and into the sketch, we can accent that actual dark area that ends up being a space if you're coming in from the north to enter the church proper, the basilica proper. And what's very interesting today, when you walk into that, right when you open the doorknob, make sure you read what your hand is touching, because that's a metal doorknob that has U.S. Customs imprinted onto it. So there's little details and kind of hidden eggs throughout the building to show the old U.S. Customs building come reborn to life. So this edge obviously is very important because it ends the temple front. I'm going to accentuate that. Come back to this part. And now this edge of the dome becomes the darkest aspect of the dome. So I'm going to come to the top and show that edge against the sky, wrap that down, and it has a little bit of its classical detail showing the profile of the orders holding it up. Again, the right side coming down and over. Just because we can see that it was darker, accentuate the darks. And right up to the corner here. And then maybe to really set this down now, at the very bottom inch, instead of having it white like the sky beyond it, bring some horizontal lines so that they're crosswalks, and then make those tones just a type of gray so the whole building sits down a bit. So we address that ground plane. And I'll turn the corner where the street meets another street, and that value comes in to kind of have the whole composition rest on a gray rather than page white. So the entire dome goes up to about 215 feet. There's 6 large granite columns from the federal building, along with their carved stone capitals, which were added to the plans as the original design had when they became available. So it really is sort of a masterpiece of the love of a parish that made this work really on a really minimal budget until they found all this great material. And really all the parishioners who were Polish became the workers that built this over that 6-year span.